Alright, so in this video we're going to look at the origin of life, or how life began on planet Earth. This is chapter 18 stuff. It's probably the stuff that's really the hardest to understand, and to be honest with you, it's not my favorite chapter, but we have to learn it, so let's just go with it. It is kind of interesting how scientists think about this and how they kind of did some cool experiments to figure this out. So they believe that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years, or 4,500 million years old. So that's kind of when the Earth began. And the oldest rocks and the oldest fossils have been discovered in the 3.8 to 3.5 billion range. Okay, so that's when life began. And these fossils are very teeny tiny bacteria, very small organisms. And then that's kind of what happened for about 200 or 2 billion years is prokaryotes began to dominate the Earth. So bacteria and archaea and really, really primitive things. And about 2.7 billion years ago, oxygen began to accumulate because we started to see photosynthesis. Began, okay? And then we're going to talk about how eukaryotic life began in about 2.1 billion years ago. So that's kind of a big thing. And then we started to see multicellular eukaryotes evolve. So we started to see fungus and very early life like that. And then at about 543 million years ago, we had the Cambrian explosion of animal life. So we saw lots and lots of different forms of animal life during that period. It was a very rapid, in terms of history of the Earth, it was still like 50 million years long expansion. You got all kinds of different animals, and so we saw plants and fungus and animals begin to colonize the land and move in and all that kind of stuff. You can see 65 million years ago we lost all the dinosaurs, and we'll talk about that. And then the first humans are kind of very, I mean, they're not even a blip on this little history of life kind of chart. So that's kind of the history of things. So we're going to first talk a little bit about how life is thought to begin, or how life came to be. There's kind of 4 things that had to happen. The first was we had the synthesis of small organic molecules. And we'll talk about one of the theories here in a second of how that came to be. One of the theories, the main theory, is based on the Urey-Miller experiment. The second theory is actually based on the fact that it might have come from a meteorite that crashed into planet Earth and brought with it some organic molecules. And that's part of the Mars experiments are about, looking for some of those organic molecules on other planets to see if that could be where life began. Then we had to join those small molecules, and we call those small molecules monomers. We'll learn this when we do chemistry, into larger molecules. Then what happened is there was a packaging of molecules into what's called probionts, protobionts, which, I'm going to kind of draw a line up to define that word. It's an aggregates, or kind of collections of biologically produced molecules surrounded by membranes. I'll run out of room. Okay, so we're kind of starting to see some cellular type life form. And then fourth, the last part is that we had the origin of self-replicating molecules. Think RNA and DNA here. They can replicate themselves and make copies of themselves, so then you can make copies of cells and you can have cells reproducing. Okay, so let's talk about, so one theory of where we got these organic molecules was from outer space. The main theory usually is actually more based on this one of the Urey-Miller experiment, which happened in the 60s. And what they did is they took molecules, they took things like ammonia, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, things like that, of early Earth, so the things that they thought were around in early Earth, and water, because they knew water was around, and they made sparks, and the sparks represent lightning. Okay, And what they did is they found, the conclusion was they found amino acids. So they're almost finding the synthesis of small molecules, and other organic molecules. And what has since come about is other scientists have replicated the Urey-Miller experiment, but they'll use a different, what they call cocktail of molecules. So they'll take different molecules that have been hypothesized to have been part of early Earth and do the same experiment, and they're actually finding that they'll get the same types of results. So that's kind of a way that experiment has been replicated as a model experiment. And so then what's kind of come of it is this last part is we had to figure out how did we get the origin of self-replicating molecules. And so what has come is this idea of this RNA world hypothesis. We have not done a lot with RNA and DNA, but RNA is a really fun molecule. And it's thought, the idea of this is really that RNA is thought to be the first genetic material, not DNA, but RNA. And the reason why is that RNA can form lots of different shapes. DNA is always going to be in its double helix normal shape, but RNA can form lots of different shapes. So like tRNA forms a shape, rRNA, ribosomal RNA forms a different shape, mRNA looks different. So you find all these different shapes or different phenotypes almost. And the other thing is it acts as an enzyme. And I know we haven't talked about enzymes yet, and so some of this is not going to make complete sense, but it will later in the year. It acts as an enzyme, so what that means is it can catalyze a reaction or speed up a reaction. So catalyzes reactions. Speeds them up, which is very important in biological processes. So that's why it's thought to have been the first kind of molecule on planet Earth. Okay. The other thing that kind of has happened as part of this origin of Earth thing is that oxygen has increased dramatically in the history of the planet Earth. And so in the very beginning, there was very little oxygen. Very little O2. Now we know that we need oxygen to breathe. And there's a reason why I'm writing in green pen right now. And that's because 2.4 billion years ago, okay, that's that abbreviation, photosynthesis began. So it begins by bacteria, and those bacteria are actually called cyanobacteria. They're still around today. We still have these guys. And what they do is they release oxygen into the atmosphere. So we're going to start to see an accumulation of oxygen in the atmosphere. And then about 1.4 billion years ago, we start to see the endosymbiosis occurs, which you're going to read about on the next page. We're going to talk about in the next page. So just write that word down. Endosymbiosis, and we get the formation of chloroplast. So we get more oxygen. So now you're going to start to see heterotrophs form, so things that eat, that can actually consume the oxygen. You're going to start to see larger multicellular organisms, and that's kind of right around, 1 billion years later is about when the Cambrian explosion happened. Okay. So then the next part is we're going to talk about these extinctions. So there's a lot of times where you had big explosions. So like the Cambrian explosion, for example, we're going to talk about that real quick. We're going to write about it. So over millions of years, it's funny that we're going to write this sentence. Over millions of years, rapid evolutionary rate. It's just funny because you're like, millions of years, rapid evolution occurred. So we had these huge, rapid, evolutionary radiations. So lots and lots of evolution, lots of adaptations. Think of evolutionary radiation as like the Darwin's finch picture. You had one finch that started, and you had all of these different finches radiate out and get a lot of different ones. And then what would happen is, so you'd have these big explosions where you'd have lots of evolution occur, and then you'd have these periods of extinctions, huge extinctions. So the first one, you don't have to know the names. You just have to know that there are 5 and some of the causes of them. In this one, we had a lot of extinction. This is when the continents were all together in Pangea. They were all kind of formed into one. And so we had extinction, or I'm sorry, this is as the continents were forming Pangea, as they were coming together. We had extinction due to environmental changes as those continents were moving around. Okay, so that was our first one. The second one, at the end of the Devonian period, this one happened especially in the ocean, and it was actually thought, or they think, that it was maybe due to a meteor or meteorite. The Permian one is where Pangea, remember, where all the continents are all squished together, they're all one big giant continent. So Pangea starts breaking apart, and we'll talk about how when we talk about this continental drift thing down here. Okay, so there's all kinds of volcanoes and earthquakes and chaos like that on the planet Earth. The Triassic is actually, we lost 65% of all species. Helps if I can spell. Oh my gosh. And this one actually was also part of that Pangea breaking apart. And then the last major one that we've had, the 5 one, is the Cretaceous one. And it was actually all large animals. This is the one that killed all the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. So anything that was actually above 25 kilograms or about 10 pounds died. So we would have lost it. And it's due to a large meteor that struck the Earth. And this one, they actually, or meteorite, they can actually see the sediments that fell during that time period. You can actually still pull up core samples from the Earth and actually see sediments. And then we have what we call the 6th extinction. We might possibly, scientists believe that we're in the 6th extinction, and that one's going to be a human cause because of all, and if you're really interested in this stuff, take AP Environmental Science. And that one's, you know, things like rapid global climate change, and losing habitat and destruction of resources and all those kinds of things. We'll talk a little bit about it in the next unit when we do ecology, but if you're really interested in it, that's what AP Environmental Science is a lot about. We're going to talk about the last couple of things in the next video just to make sure it all gets in. So you're going to see how these continents break apart and how we figure out how old things are.